Hello, everyone, and welcome to How Do I Workshop? As always, guest starring Judge Bunny. In this presentation, I'll be going over how to run a successful workshop for your conference. First of all, having a table of contents for presentations is something that people who answer Facebook polls like, so we're doing that. And if you don't like it, then you should answer the next Facebook poll that asks about stuff like this so that I won't do it. First, I'm going to define what a workshop is. Then I'm going to go over the different types of workshops and their strengths and weaknesses. And then I'm going to talk about some general tips that apply to most types of workshops. And then after that, we're going to discuss some workshop scenarios and, try and apply all that knowledge that we just learned. Kind of like a workshop. Anyway, so what is a workshop? This is a workshop. This is not what we're talking about. In a judge conference context, it can be described. Pause. Isaac, are you not seeing the stream or is there an issue? Should I pause or should I keep going? Well, the comment disappeared. So I'm gonna assume that I should just keep going. Okay, great. Excellent. Glad we addressed that. Okay. Where was? Yes. What is a workshop? It's not a Mishra's workshop. It is, but it's not. In a judge conference context, workshops can kind of be described as an interactive presentation designed to help judges learn a specific thing about judging. Almost all workshops will have some type of scenarios that kind of simulate judge calls to varying degrees of realism. Essentially, the presenter is going to set up something akin to a judge call, and then an attendee will take that call as if it were a real live judge call with real players and real cards. Notably, in this presentation, I will be using a slightly broader than normal definition of the word workshop, since a lot of the stuff I mentioned is still useful for things like question and answer sessions, which aren't usually described or considered as workshops, but I wanted to include them because they are a really important type of interactive presentation that I don't see enough of. And again, like I said, a lot of the stuff I say can kind of apply to them. Next, you might be wondering why we'd want to run a workshop instead of a traditional lecture. Well, first, it's been shown that interactivity keeps people from falling asleep during a presentation, and it's been shown that it's harder to learn when you're asleep than awake, irrespective of what the School of Hypnopedia says. Uh, Also, on a more serious note, it's been shown that like research has shown that it's actually engaging with the material rather than just listening to it will help you retain it better. And I think Kevin touched on this in his previous presentation. He's like, when you have to write feedback, you're actually sort of like processing what you just learned. When you have to answer a question about what you just heard, it's gonna get in the brain more than if you don't. Now, sometimes the point of running a workshop can be to encourage socializing and networking or to like loosen up a crowd. This is totally fine. I'm not dunking on this. However, that is not the focus of this presentation. The focus of this presentation is to help optimize your workshop for education, not for any other reasons. Um, like I said earlier, I'm going to be going over the different types of workshops to help and to help you more easily compare them and ultimately figure out which style might work best for your specific group of attendees and your conference venue. I'm going to be giving each type of presentation or each type of workshop a rating. First, based on the average educational quality for all participants, the level of social comfort for participants. So, like if this rating is super high, that means like there's a very low amount of social anxiety for your participants. And then the logistical ease of running that type of workshop. So if it's like super easy, you're going to get lots of stars. And if it's super hard, you're going to get very few stars. Also, because the advent of online presentations, I don't like this one. I'll also be giving each presentation either a physical or digital stamp of approval based on whether it's, in my opinion, and based on my experiences, like worth running in that medium. Believe me, like some workshops were never meant to be run through Discord and they should never be run through Discord or Zoom, or I don't care what technology you're using. Do not do them online. They freaking suck. So let's get right into talking about workshops. The first type of workshop I'm going to First type of workshop I'm going to talk about is something I call the one-on-one deep dive workshop. This is typically run as a standalone session in an isolated space away from the main room of the conference. There's often one presenter and like one attendee. The presenter will run a scenario either by being the player or like they'll just have cards on the table and they'll answer questions about the scenario. Um, and then afterwards, after the attendee kind of addresses the scenario, they're going to do like an in-depth discussion and debrief with the attendee and like tell them what was good and what was bad. One of the major benefits to this type of workshop is that the scenario can be super tailored to the specific judge's skill level. So it's just the right difficulty. So, you pull in an L1 and you're like, okay, I'll just use one of my L1 scenarios. Or you pull in like a super experienced L2 and you're like, okay, let's give them like this super deep scenario. The ideal type of scenarios for this kind of workshop are scenarios with a lot of things to be aware of, such as card counting or investigations, or even just complex judge calls. If you're going to go through all the work of taking an attendee away from the rest of the group, you want to make sure that your scenario has enough substance to justify all the logistical hoops that you had to jump through to like get this to happen, which is kind of why this exercise is best suited to the more experienced judges. If you just take like an L1 and you're like, okay, let's, test you on, somebody drew 8 cards at regular. If they know the jar, they're going to answer that in about 1 second. If they answer it wrong, they're still going to answer it in about 1 or 2 seconds. And then you go through a very brief debrief that's basically like, good job, you read the jar, or you should read the jar. And then you push them back in the main group, and it's kind of dumb. One thing to note with these more complex scenarios is that your attention to detail needs to be super high. So because you're running a deeper scenario, make sure that any elements the attendee might want to look at are present and available. Like if your attendee wants to do a cheating investigation, make sure they are able to do that. However, there is still an upper limit to how complex your scenario can and should be. And at some point, it simply becomes like you're in Christmas land. And it's so unrealistic that it just doesn't even feel like a judge call anymore. A good rule of thumb is that if your scenario looks like the one on this slide, it's probably a terrible scenario. Do not do that. This is awful. This is a fustercluck. Another benefit to these deep dive one-on-one things is that you can actually recycle scenarios for each attendee. Like you can have like one L1 scenario, one L2 scenario, and then you just kind of run them with each person, and you've only had to prepare 2 scenarios, which is great. So overall, think that these types of presentations are very good at teaching the attendee since it's effectively just a one-on-one tutoring session. So it's amazing. The amount of social comfort is very high since there's only one other person watching. Note that the amount of social like anxiety isn't completely gone because the presenter is still likely somebody that the attendee is going to be looking up to. So just be wary that like you'll be totally chill doing this. Your attendee might not be. And finally, because of the detail-oriented scenarios and the fact that it needs to be run in a space independent from the rest of the conference and you need to like pull people out, and because it sucks up a whole presenter for like only one person, this one's actually really logistically kind of frustrating. Like I like this kind of presentation. I wish I could always run it, but you just don't always have the space. Um, if you're doing this online, the logistical challenges are actually slightly lower. So the logistical ease goes up. But it's still quite high since you still have to organize people into basically a separate schedule and pull them into one-on-one chats. So it's not just like a breeze. So this kind of workshop works great in person. I think it's fantastic. And while I haven't seen the exact same thing online, I think it could be executed to moderate success. The next type of workshop I'm going to talk about is the one-on-one discussion. And I just lost my Discord. Give me 1 second. Okay, it's back. This is where the presenter breaks people into two-person groups and has them discuss a topic. The common pitfalls of this are like not giving people a specific enough topic to discuss and not giving people an appropriate amount of time to actually discuss it. When in doubt, err on the side of less time rather than more, since attendees that feel like their conversation got kind of cut off can always cycle back around to it later, and like that's great. If they go back to talk to that person during break, you've helped them form a social connection. But attendees that finish early are going to feel like super awkward and they're just going to kind of stare at each other and be like, well, is there anything else you want to talk about? Like, no. Okay. Also remember that your audience is going to be like, you're not really going to have a flat skill level in your entire audience. So the best types of questions, the ones that everyone can answer. So, like, talk about your most recent mistake, or talk about your favorite judge call, or like, what's your favorite magic card? Like, these kinds of questions will work fine, but like, discuss the GRV, like partial fixes. Like, if there's like an L2 that's paired with an L1, the L1's gonna be like, "Bleh, I have no idea what those are." And the L2's like, "Okay, I honestly barely know what they are." A lot of L2s don't know what all the partial fixes are. I kind of just look them up. But like, it's not going to be a great discussion. So there's that. I think if you want to do something like this in person, the best way is to incorporate into a lecture by asking the audience to have a short conversation with somebody adjacent to them and only giving them like a minute or two for this discussion. And using this as a way to loosen up the crowd and prepare them for more interactivity later is like a really great way to use this. I had this happen at a recent conference and it was totally fine. They're just like, discuss your most like, yeah, I think your most terrible judge call. And we did, and it was fine, and it was a minute, and it was great. Like, well, it wasn't great. It was like fine. It chilled me out. I've seen this done online twice, and um, it's really awkward to have a voice chat with somebody online that you probably don't know. Half the people don't have mics. A lot of people are also super blindsided by being suddenly forced into like this really exposed one-on-one chat because it's very different. And like, yes, maybe it was in the event description, but like it also nobody reads those and it might not have been. Also online, there's the unfortunate reality that, like, there's a lot of no-shows or people who have just, like, turned on their Zoom and then, like, walked away, which means that a bunch of attendees are in a breakout room or Discord chat all alone, which is even worse. And finally, dividing people into these one-on-one groups is so logistically taxing and takes so much time, meaning that you want people to be discussing something for, like, a long time. Like, if you break people into groups and take 5 minutes doing that and then tell them to talk for a minute, it's a giant waste of time. So you're probably gonna be like, "Hey, everybody talk for 5 to 10 minutes," which leads to that awful social awkwardness that I talked about at the beginning. Meaning that, like, I am not going to say this simply cannot be done properly online, but both times I have been a part of it, it has been honestly the most miserable experience. One of them was honestly the worst presentation I have ever been to. So, overall, I often don't think people tend to learn a lot from these types of presentations. Because you're talking to a total stranger, I think the amount of social comfort is, like, fairly low. I would give it like I've given it 1 star here. It might be like 1.5 stars, but it's only 3 stars. And since there aren't any props or detailed instructions, it's actually super easy to organize these, which I mean is nice, I guess. It's a good icebreaker, but don't expect anything else from it. For online events, while learning remains low, social comfort drops even lower because like a one-on-one mic chat is worse than a turn to your guy beside you and talk to them. And logistics just like gets so freaking complicated. So I think while this is fine for in person, I don't think it's amazing. Oh my God, do not do this online. Now we're going to move away from one-on-one workshops and talk about small group workshops. So the first one is what I'm going to call the small group buffet. Don't worry, these are just names to make it easier for myself. There will not be a quiz later. You will not be graded and there will not be points. I promise. In this workshop, you have stations around the room or in separate Discord channels, and the groups can kind of travel to them and complete them, generally without actors present. There's just cards on the table or a piece of paper that describes the station and what's going on. You should create scenarios that you think will be a good level for most of your attendees. I think it's better to go a little easier than harder, since a scenario that's like way too over the heads of your participants isn't really going to teach them very much. And like if you have 3 L1s and there's like, again, some sort of complex comprel scenario on the table, they're just going to stare at it and be like, what do we do? And they're not going to get anything out of it. And they're going to feel bad about themselves, which is no good. Um, Obviously, your more experienced judges are going to be a little bored with this model. Luckily, conferences, if you look at like the how attendance goes, especially I mean, in most conferences, honestly, unless it's an L2 plus conference, like the bulk of your attendees are going to be like lower level judges and then like a few higher level. And as you go up, like in experience, you will get less and less higher level judges. So what you want to do is you want to encourage your experienced judges to kind of not all clump together with their friends, but disperse through the less experienced judges and kind of be a mentor and like kind of guide them. Jeremy says that he wants points, and we have given him 2 points. So there you go. Are you happy? You better be happy. Anyway, if you're a little tighter on space or props, this type of workshop can also be implemented by giving groups a worksheet describing each scenario. This is not quite as immersive and also feels kind of homeworky, but it can achieve the same type of collaborative group experience and can get everyone kind of talking about a thing, which it's not bad, honestly. Afterwards, the small groups usually reconvene into a large group and go over the answers. This is really freaking important. Oh my god. Do not skip it. If one of your groups was confused about one of the scenarios, you want to make sure that you actually clear that up and not just be like, okay, well, we went to a presentation and we talked about like this thing for 5 minutes and then we still didn't know the answer. Like that's useless. So please make sure you do your debrief and give yourself enough time to do your debrief. So overall, this workshop is not peak education. Um, but when you consider the ease of setup and the high social comfort, I think this is a super solid presentation style. And if you're looking at what you should do for your first workshop, I think this is a really good choice because, like, it's not. I think there are a lot of pitfalls with the other types of workshops that newer presenters fall into. And this one is more fail safe than those. Like there are less things for people to bung up. And so on average, even if the presenter is kind of inexperienced or kind of like meh, like it's still going to run pretty okay. For online, this actually has a much higher logistical rating. Like it is not as logistically easy to sort of finagle because, like I said, it throws people into small groups, which is really hard in Discord and Zoom. And it has a lot of the and the socially it's awkward to like get on the mic and like some people don't have mic. Like basically everything I discussed about the one-on-one. It's not as awful because there are more people. So if you have one no-show out of, your 4-person group, all right, you're fine. Also it forces those groups to kind of move around on their own, which is also more awkward than in person. So I give this one actually a pretty big stamp of approval for in person conferences since the smaller groups kind of really push people to interact with the material more. It's much harder to remain passive when you're in a group of only 4 people. However, online, like I said, it's the logistics kind of kill it. And yeah, that's about it. The next workshop I'm going to talk about is the guided tour. This is where you have 1 or 2 presenters bringing a small group of 3 to 4 attendees through a set of RP'd scenarios. So this is a bit of a merger between the one-on-one deep dive and the small group buffet. It's basically a small group buffet, but only with one group. And like, yeah, and a presenter. The idea is that the small group allows each person to do a couple scenarios, and then after each scenario, the other 2 observers get to give feedback. As well as the presenter. The presenter will usually also give feedback, usually last because you want the other people to practice giving feedback before you give your feedback. You don't want to color what their impressions were. I really like this kind of workshop since it gives a ton of experience to each attendee and allows them to try RPing a scenario without the pressure of doing so in front of like a 30-person conference. But it also supports more than just one attendee. Like the one-on-one, you only got one person, right? But this one, you have 3 people, and people also get to exercise their feedback skills, which is a great bonus. It's also nice because the presenter can kind of keep things on track, so the group will never get super lost or feel overwhelmed by any of the scenarios. Like they can just move on, or they'll be able to answer any questions if things go awry. And again, if the presenter knows the skill level of each attendee, they can choose the scenarios that are appropriate for them. So you're like, okay, Purple Kitty is going to go up next. I know Purple Kitty is a super experienced L2, so I'm going to bring the group to the cheating investigation scenario that's super in depth, and vice versa. I've seen this type of presentation run concurrent to other conference presentations. So then the small group is kind of in a separate room and taken away from the larger group. And that small group just runs scenarios for the 50 minutes. This, let's see. Personally, this is my favorite type of workshop. I think each attendee gets a lot out of it. The social comfort is pretty high because of the small group thing. Unfortunately, because of the specific venue setup required and the fact that it takes away a presenter from the main group, it's not always feasible, and that's why it gets such a low logistics rating. Like the one-on-one deep dive, like this, like I do like the one-on-one deep dives, but this is actually my preferred because I think it hits more people. You get more bang for your buck. Like I feel like this is my favorite type of workshop. But I always try and push it if I'm doing it on in person, but often we just don't have the extra room, and that really sucks because I really like running this one. Um, I have seen this done online, and it was actually fairly successful. It was a New Zealand conference. Um, the learning and social comfort, I think, still remain very high. However, the logistics seemed like a total nightmare for the organizer. From what I heard, I didn't talk to the organizer, but I talked to somebody who talked to the organizers. This is secondhand information, but it's decent. But apparently the organizer had to put in a ton of work to ensure that the conference ran smoothly. They like balanced groups so that like every group had like one experienced judge and like two or three inexperienced judges. They like made sure everybody was going to show up. They made sure everybody had a mic. They like wrangled a whole bunch of presenters who were willing to do this thing. Like, oh God, they put in a ton of effort, which is why this actually gets a negative logistics rating. When I got to this part, I was like, oh, maybe I should have had a 4-star scale, but we're here, and so it just gets a blue star for, oh my God, this is so freaking hard to actually execute properly online. So this type of presentation works great in person, but again, I give it a soft avoid for online. Like I have seen it run successfully, so that's not a hard avoid, but you're gonna have to really haul butt if you want to make it happen. Next type of workshop I'm going to talk about is probably the one that most people are actually familiar with, and something I call the large group theater, because basically it's a bunch of people watching one or two presenters act out a scenario and one participant from the audience addressing the scenario. I've seen this lots of times at conferences, and I think it's generally the type of workshop new presenters gravitate towards. Unfortunately, I also think this is one of the hardest workshops to execute well, and it has a lot of failure points. If the scenario involves specific cards or board states, it can be super confusing for most of the people watching, since only the people in the very front are actually going to be able to see anything. I know at a recent conference, two presenters chose to do this kind of workshop, and I didn't want to be like super pushy. I'm like, this is probably more valuable for the less experienced judges. So I sat in the back and I saw basically nothing. So I also couldn't give any feedback other than, hey, I couldn't see anything because this presentation style sucks. Um, so to avoid this issue, I think it's way better to focus on behavior-based scenarios, since those types of things are way more easily perceivable from a distance. So like this is how you took the judge call, or like this is how you address the like kind of, belligerent player, and like stuff that's easier to see rather than like here's all these fiddly cards on the table and, no people in the back really can't see them. Well, every one of these presentations has been an amazing social experience. Like they're usually super funny and like a really good time. I think very few of them have actually been very educational. Like I don't think I have learned very much from large group theaters. The single participant who is actually taking the call, their social comfort kind of just completely bottoms out because they're going in front of the entire conference and performing. That's super stressful. On the bright side, the logistical input for this type of presentation is fairly easy since it doesn't involve a bunch of stations or separate rooms or separate schedules or pulling people out. As for online, I think it can work, but it effectively boils down to a participant getting on the mic and working through a scenario. And I think this is honestly just worse than running like a Q&A where everybody can type into Discord like their answers. The ratings remain largely the same with the exception of social comfort. While still low, it actually gets it's kind of easier to get on the mic because you can't see everybody seeing you. You're just in your room and you're talking, and you can kind of forget that there are 30 other people listening to you. So, that's fine. In person, I think these types of presentations are generally a lot of fun and somewhat functional. So like I give it a soft stamp of approval. And again, if you're doing soft skills, I think it's much better. As for online, I give it a soft avoid. I think it is fine. I just think there are better options. But if you do it, it's not going to be a train wreck. The last type of workshop I'm going to talk about is something I like to call the large group quiz. These are basically lectures that will present some information and then ask the audience questions about the information. These actually work great with large groups since it allows people who know the answers to speak up and lets the people who don't stay silent and retain their dignity. The pitfall is that it's easier for the majority of participants to just be passive, unlike in the small group workshops where it's kind of forcing everybody to, dig in. Also, like even if you think you know the answer, it can be very intimidating to speak up in front of a large group because if you get it wrong, it's like embarrassing. And sometimes you have a group of like introverts or people who are like not really confident enough and they just like stare silent at you after you ask a question. You're like, okay, anyone have the answer? And everyone's just like, "Buh." So a good way to avoid this is to offer small incentives to people who participate, such as candy or chocolate, or I don't know, sometimes I give out bunny tokens. Just make sure that what you are offering is vegetarian and peanut free. I was at a recent conference and the candy thing was great, except half the people were peanut allergic to peanuts. And like half the candy was Reese's Pieces. So yeah, just be aware. The quality of learning for this one is very reasonable. It's basically a lecture plus. The social comfort for those that do participate is rather low, but because of the self selection, people can effectively moderate the amount of anxiety they experience. This is arguably true for the large group theater, but you can always answer one question, and that is, I think, still less stressful than running a whole scenario. Also, the fact that this type of presentation doesn't require much more setup than a traditional lecture means that the logistic hurdles are really low. Like it's very easy to run this kind of thing. For online, I think everything remains mostly the same. However, the social comfort increases a lot because attendees just simply type into the chat, which puts them on the spot significantly less than answering a question in a physical room full of people. And especially in the bigger conferences, a ton of people are typing in the chat. So you type something stupid in the chat, it's going to be buried in memes and other answers like super quick. So I think this type of presentation works well in person and it works well online. And I've seen it be super successful in both mediums. In particular, this is great for presentations on rules and policy. And I think if you are running a rules or policy presentation, it is a crime not to use some amount of this format. Okay. So now that we know what the different types of workshops are, let's talk about some things you can do to make your workshop better, or at least very least some things you can do to keep it from being terrible and embarrassment to like your mom. Remember, you want your mom to think your presentation is good. The first and arguably most important thing is to make sure you know your audience. Giving comparable scenarios to new L1s is going to be a giant painful waste of everyone's time. In a similar vein, make sure expectations are clear. Do you expect your attendees to fail most of the scenarios or to pass them? Be clear about it upfront. Now, you might think it's weird that you want attendees to fail some scenarios, but this is reasonable. If you expect your attendees to pass every scenario, they probably aren't learning very much, and people tend to remember their mistakes more vividly than their successes. Just remember that if they can't get any of the scenarios, you're probably not giving scenarios relevant to your audience. And again, certain groups are going to be more okay with failing scenarios than others. Typically, your newer judges, a failure is going to hit them a lot harder, especially if it's public, than your more experienced judges, because your newer judges are going to be like, they already they probably lack some amount of that confidence that you gain from judging and, being a member of the community and knowing that you are not a terrible judge. Again, that's not a blanket thing, but it's a general thing. Next thing to keep in mind about scenarios is to keep them real. I have seen so many overly aggressive players and crying children in presentations, and I have never seen either of these things in real life. And I have done a lot of events. I've seen some like medium aggressive players and some like somewhat sad children, but like nothing to the extent that I have seen in workshops. I don't think that you are never going to run into a super aggressive player or a super sad child. I just think that resources are better spent on preparing judges for calls that actually come up multiple times per event rather than calls that like a judge might encounter once or honestly never in their entire career. Like I have seen more judges screw up like, I don't know, looking at extra cards calls than handling belligerent players just because looking at extra cards comes up so often and belligerent players just like don't. Another common pitfall I see with newer presenters is a lack of detail. I touched on this earlier, but like if your workshop is the type to feature props such as decks or cards on the table, ensure that they're like set up in a realistic and believable manner. Like I'm assuming the reason you even have cards on the table is to help the scenario feel more like a live call. So make sure you put in the effort to fully flesh out the game state. It is super frustrating for an attendee if they have to ask whether differently saved cards or incorrectly tapped mana are relevant. It's even worse if they start to address the issue in character and they're told partway through that, like, oh, that's not part of the scenario. Just pretend that's fine. And then they're just like, well, what is and isn't part of the scenario? I think it is okay to have like a couple things that are part of the scenario as long as those are stated outright. Like one of the big ones is like proxies for cards that you don't own. That's fine. I don't expect you to buy a Hammer Time deck if you want to run a Hammer Time scenario. Not all of us have like a million disposable incomes, but just make sure you say, "Hey, the proxies they're just like because I don't own the cards." And if you that takes 1 second and it's going to like fix so many problems. Um just remember, like, if there are too many things, it really starts to break immersion. Like, oh, just pretend there's a graveyard and a life pad, and pretend there are lands on the like. Frick, what's the point after a while, right? A few key things to remember when setting up a scenario are to make sure that the graveyard makes sense, make sure the mana on board is tapped properly, have some life pads or life totals available, and make sure the number of cards on board and in hands adds up properly, just in case your attendee starts card counting. Like, even if it's not card counting scenario, you want them to be able to do that, you know? Honestly, though, if you are planning a board state, actually just play out the game up until that point. Uh, Games of Magic are, like, super complex, and trying to just, like, fabricate a game that's on turn 3 from nothing is honestly way harder than just playing the first 3 turns. I recently ran a workshop with like, I don't know, like I think it was like 7 to 10 different scenarios, and I had decks set up and all that. And what I did is I just sat in front of my computer, I played the game, and then I took notes of what all the cards were, and I was able to like do life total adjustments. Like I just played by myself. And then I just wrote that down, and then all the board states were correct, and I was able to answer every question the attendees asked, and there were no like, oh, just pretend that's not a thing. Like it ran smooth. Um, One thing you can do to kind of help this along is like feel free to demonic tutor for each draw if you need specific cards or like, fake your opening hands. Like that kind of stuff is fine. Like just to make sure that you can actually combo off on turn 3 if that's where you're going. Unfortunately, with this amount of attention to detail and complexity, you are going to run into protracted setup time. Waiting for a presenter to set up a board state is really boring in the same way that watching your opponent storm off is. Ways to circumvent setup time are going to vary depending on what type of presentation you're running. If it's scenarios that are kind of like in a separate room and you just bring people or groups in, this is easy. Just don't call your person in until it's set up and just make sure they're all set up and you're good to go. If it's one large group, have scenarios be like set up by a secondary volunteer while doing the debrief and discussion about the previous scenario. So like typically in a large group you have like 2 actors. So one actor is like, okay, let's talk about and give feedback on what's going on, and then the other actor is like scooping up cards and putting down new cards, right? It's a little annoying because then during the feedback people like can't totally ask more questions or like can't point to things, but I think your trade-off is you get the benefit is strong. Um, if, if it's small groups, I'm sorry, I did these a little out of order. So let's look back at the middle bubble. I mean, they're just pictures, so you can just look at all the pictures whenever. If you have small groups that have stations around the room, just putter around and reset the stations as groups are moving through them. You'll probably have enough time between groups. So that's fine. If it's just you and you need to run multiple scenarios, just make sure you have as much setup pre-prepared as possible. Like have all your life tote pads stacked in a way that you can just take one from the previous scenario and throw it in the trash, and your next one's right there. If you have a specific set of cards, just put those on top of the library in a specific order and maybe practice a couple times laying them out. But again, I think you can usually, kind of cheese load times depending on your specific setup. If you have actors, once again, I presume your purpose is to enhance realism. If that's the case, encourage your actors to stay in character. Otherwise, what's the point of having actors? A good trick I learned from D&D is if somebody breaks character, just respond as if they're still in character. It's going to feel really weird, but it is also incredibly effective. So, like, just like if they say something, oh, I have a 15-minute warning, I have noticed that. They say something, just pretend they're in character. Have your actor, like I've seen judges be like, turn to the presenter who is currently playing a player, and they're like, well, what do I do? If you're the player, you just look back and you're like, well, you're asking me? I mean, I want a match win and a soda. Like, they're just like, okay, right, I have to stay in character. Got it. Alternatively, what we did in LARP was we held two fingers by our head to indicate we weren't in character. Uh, this kind of encourages people to stay in character in a softer way, since basically, if you're not in character, you have to do something. So we just, there's more of a mutual understanding that you're in character if you're not doing the thing. Another common problem is that scenarios have too many gotchas. I'm defining a gotcha as expecting the attendee to figure out or investigate something that seems very unrelated to the call, and basically something we wouldn't expect judges to normally do on the floor. After all, the purpose, like I keep saying, is to simulate actual judge calls. So if you're expecting things of your attendee that you wouldn't expect from a judge on a real call, like you probably have a gotcha. Like you're not really you're kind of defeating the whole purpose of doing the thing. Like the last thing I want a workshop to accomplish is to teach judges to ask like 1,000 irrelevant questions for every judge call. Like if you're like, for things that like, I called my own LEC on myself, you're like, okay, let's ask 50 investigation questions because the workshop I was in had this be cheating in some very esoteric way. Like, oh my God, don't do that. The next important thing for all presentations, but especially so for workshops, get 2 or 3 other experienced judges to look over your scenarios and work through them. If your local L3 or event grinder is like having a problem with the scenario, it's probably too difficult for your conference attendee. They'll also be able to tell you if there's any like random glitches, like, hey, why is this here? Or if there's any gotchas. And especially they'll be able to ask you questions that you never even thought of. Like I have shown my like scenarios to somebody, like, they'll start investigating for cheating. I'm like, why are you doing that? And you're like, because of this, this, and this. I'm like, oh, yeah, I guess this does look like cheating. I do not want it to look like cheating. Let me fix that. Or, you missed X, Y, and Z. And so this is actually a totally different thing. And also, they can just make sure that your answers are right. Like, frick, you want your answers to be right. The very last pitfall I want to talk about is running out of time. And yes, I haven't run out of time. Oh, so glad I made it to the slide. Why does this slide last? Oh, because if I run out of time, I don't want people to. Anyway, workshops or anything interactive usually takes longer than you think it will. Like once you get sometimes it's really hard to get a crowd going, but once you get them going, they keep going and going and going, and it's really hard to like get them to not. So a good rule of thumb is to give yourself a little more time than you think you'll need. Since if your presentation runs late, it's actually much more damaging to a conference than one that ends a little bit early. Because if you run late, you're either eating people's breaks, which they might need, and those are also just important. If things are really tight, you're pushing the other conference presentations back. If it's dual track, you're screwing up the tracks. Like if people are dropping in and out, if you run late, it's gonna somebody's gonna drop in for a specific presentation and you're gonna be going overtime, and it's very frustrating for an organizer. So and with most workshops, you're gonna want to go through some kind of debrief, like I said, after the scenario. And like I said, this is really, really important. So make sure you budget the correct amount of time to actually accomplish this. Because if you have to cut your debrief, you basically invalidated your workshop. So a good trick with this one weird trick, you can avoid your presentations going over or under time. Is what I do is I just present a jillion scenarios, or I just prepare like a bunch of scenarios, like a ton. And I always put them at the end of the presentation, or I always make sure I have scenarios at the end of my presentations. And I'll have like 10 scenarios prepped. And I'm pretty sure we're not going to get through all 10, but if it's a slow day or everybody's super smart, then maybe we do. And then that way I can just run scenarios bomb, bomb, bomb until we're out of time. So I'll look, and if I've got like 4 or 5 minutes left, I'm like, okay, let's like not run another scenario. Or if they've only been taking 2 minutes, I'll be like, okay, let's run another scenario. And that way theoretically, that way I'm always on time. So before we get to the next section, I just want to say that like a lot of these are mistakes that I have made. I have run a fair amount of interactive slash workshop slash stuff like this. And a lot of this is just, this is the thing I did and it was horrible. And so it was horrible and don't do it. Because I realized that some of this presentation might come across as me dunking on every other presenter is horrible. No, like most of this stuff is stuff I've done. I've run overtime so much and it is horrible. And so just don't be like me. Be better than me or learn from me. Anyway, so we've gone through the different types of presentations and the common pitfalls. So now I have some scenarios to go through, and it looks like how much time do I have? I think I had 15 minutes at 12:05. I've got about 3 minutes left, so I'm not sure if we're actually going to be able to get through the scenario. Um, Let me follow my own advice and not go over time this time. So we are going to skip the scenarios because my talking actually just took way longer than I thought it would. How did that even happen? Anyway, so instead I'm going to actually just open the floor to questions because I have 3 minutes. Does that mean I have 8 minutes? Did I add wrong? Adding is really freaking hard. I'm seeing another person type in chat. If I had 8 minutes, we're going to do at least one scenario. I think 8 minutes is fine. Confirmed and I? Confirmed and I? Well, you know what, Jones? It's your fault if I run over time now. Boop. Bunny is running an L2 plus conference. The scenario is a rules question regarding Inkmoth Nexus and Colossus Hammer. However, the players also have Magus the Moon enchanted with Frogify on the table. The judge on the call is expected to notice and correct the player's understanding of the board state. Do we think this is a good scenario? Also, it's audience interaction time, and if you don't interact, I'm going to be super sad. I don't have any candies to offer you, but I can offer you points that mean nothing. I'll have to find the little one thing from earlier, but I can totally do that. Ba, 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 ba. Ba, 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 ba. Okay, so I have I have Jones saying, this is a complex scenario, but it's not super unreasonable to come across something like this. I think Frogify is sitting in for, I don't know, I guess before Oko got banned, an Oko effect. James says, I feel like this is a good scenario if we are actively discussing layers. If this is just how do auras work, I think it's not good. I don't see anybody else typing. Personally, now this is not like a rules thing where I can be like, this is the correct answer. So this is my opinion. So if you think differently, that is totally fine. And honestly, you might be right. Personally, I think this is a good question, especially in the L2 plus conference, because L2 like more experienced judges should understand that you kind of need to look at the board state a little bit And glancing over and noticing like this Magus thing happening, I think is somewhat reasonable. This is on like it's on the cusp of a gotcha because like but I could also see this happening in real life. If this is for like L1s or like more inexperienced judges, I probably wouldn't run a scenario like this just because it's a little deep, right? There's a lot going on. The interaction in itself, like both interactions are complex. So the L1s and more experienced judges are probably going to be a little overwhelmed by just that part. And if we expect them to continue looking at other stuff, like okay, so now I am fairly certain. My personal timer says I've been running for 47 minutes. So I'm not gonna bang out another scenario because like I said, I don't want to run over time. Um one thing I do want to 5-minute warning. Well, that scenario only took 2 minutes. Also, what we have discovered in this presentation is that Toby can't do math at all. Sure, let's try another one. 5 minutes seems reasonable. Hi, this is appropriate. Bunny is running a workshop that only has 5 minutes left. Her previous question have taken 7 to 8 minutes each. She decides to run the questions anyway since they cover topics that she thinks are really important. Is this a good decision? Opening to the audience. Pa 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 pa. Thanks, Jones. Yeah. We've been discussing this one a lot, so I think this one might yeah, might be a little more cut and dry than if I hadn't been trying to be super conscious. I'm just really sick of running over time. I've gotten people keep getting mad at me for going over time. Um, take it to a post-conference discussion. Make the material available offline. I think that or online or just make the material available. I think that's a really good solution. Yep, yep. I think letting the attendees know that there is more material and just making it available to them is a really good solution. James said something interesting, which is use up all your time, but once it's over, then offer to take it to a post conference discussion. I have seen presenters do this where they're just like, okay, well, we're in break, but I just want to run through my other scenarios. I personally actually think this is kind of damaging because attendees don't want to leave if they feel like there's more material being presented. So, and attendees aren't necessarily going to self-moderate and do what is like people in general are not going to self-moderate and do what is good for them necessarily. Maybe somebody really needs to go to the bathroom, but they also really don't want to miss the learning. And if learning is happening, they're just going to hold it and be uncomfortable. Or like maybe they're really thirsty, but they like want to miss anything. Like and so you're forcing somebody to like make a decision then. And I personally think that's kind of worse. Um There may be different schools of thought on this. So again, I'm going to preface this with this is my personal opinion. And if you think I'm stupid, first leave me feedback. Don't just say, I think you're stupid. Say, I think you're stupid because you said this thing that I disagree with. And I'm like, okay, that's much more useful to me. Because if I get 10 people that are like, Toby, I'll disagree with you. I love X. Then I'm like, okay, maybe I need to update my thoughts to also like understand that maybe I don't love X, but 10 people. Okay. So post-conference, not immediately after topic time. Okay. Thank you for the update, Jeremy. I think that is I personally think that is a much better solution. Like, hey, come meet with me after or PM, I can talk about X. But anyway, I think I am well and truly out of time at this point. So thank you for your participation. Thank you for being here. I know it was a very cozy group this time, but we still had some people chatting, and that makes me happy. Please leave me feedback because this is my first time presenting this one because it's a very unique topic. But I also think it's very useful. I'm just really freaking sick of seeing terrible workshops. So leave me feedback on what you think was good, what you think I was wrong about. All that. Isaac has just posted the feedback form. So yeah, that's about it. Thanks so much, friends. I'm gonna sign off now. Mwah.